We now come that Topital 2 has been withdrawn, so we'll go straight to Shadow Secretary David Lammy.
A decade of cuts, court closures and mishandling of the pandemic has created a backlog in the Crown Courts of nearly 50,000 cases. It could reach 195,000 by 2024. The court service say we need at least an extra 200 venues to fill the gap. But on the 19th of October 2020, the Judicial Office confirmed only 5 Nightingale courts were hearing jury trials. This is a failure of epic proportions, leading to thousands of victims of serious crime being denied justice. Has the Lord Chancellor failed to ask for enough resources to get justice moving, or has he been denied it by the Treasury?
Secretary Butland.
The right honourable gentleman is wrong on all fronts. First of all, we secured an extra £80 million worth of funding for from the Treasury to deal specifically with COVID court recovery. That came on top of the largest investment and increase in court maintenance in 20 years during his stewardship as well. That has resulted in not just the scaling up of courts, so that today, Mr Speaker, we have 255 courtrooms, which is ahead of the target I'd set for the end of October, that are hearing jury trials, but we are going to go further. We have already opened 19 courtrooms under the Nightingale Court Scheme. We're going further. This is not a story of failure. This is a story of success and hard work on the part of everybody in the courtrooms, in the court service. And I will say this to him: the projections that he's mentioned are based upon some pretty inaccurate predictions that do not bear the closest of scrutiny.
Mr Speaker, can I just ask what the Government is doing to support the resourcing of magistrates' courts, which are vital to the dispensation of justice in my Sedgefield constituency and indeed across the UK? In particular, for victims of violent crime and domestic abuse, it's important that these are expedited promptly.
Secretary Butland.
Well, like my honourable friend, I'm very grateful for the efforts of the magistracy in County Durham and elsewhere for their part in keeping our system working. And all victims, none more so than those he mentions, deserve prompt justice. And that's why I am grateful for every part of the criminal justice system who are working so hard to ensure case progression. And to that end, we've made available £1 million to improve the recruitment process. We've reviewed our planned recruitment in line with changing demands on our magistracy, and indeed are consulting on proposals to increase the mandatory retirement age of all judicial office holders.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. When somebody commits an offence and they are under the age of 18 and then join the long list of waiting for their case to come to a hearing, they then are tried in the adult courts. This cannot be right. So will the Justice Secretary review this and ensure that if crime is committed by a youth, that it is tried through the youth justice system?
Minister Butland.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. She can be reassured that indeed these issues are being specifically examined at the moment. Both the Minister of State and I, who is on the front bench, take a particular interest in the threshold and the change from youth status to adult. It applies in a multiplicity of different ways. I can assure her, for example, that in sentencing, people who might have attained the age of 18 are dealt with as youths for the purposes of sentencing. But the position is complex, and we indeed are looking at all the ramifications of it, including the one that she has raised.
Gordon Henderson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Would my honourable friend explain what she's doing to ensure prison staff have access to swift testing to avoid unnecessary periods of self-isolation, and has consideration been given to making mandatory the wearing of face masks by prison officers when on duty?
Minister Fraser.
Well, I thank the honourable member for his question, and I would like to thank all the staff who have been working so hard in particularly challenging time. To answer his question, we have started to routinely test staff, and we're providing PPE now, including medical-grade face masks.
We now come to Florence Session-Lerman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Access to justice is under threat. In my constituency of Vauxhall, we've just lost one of our most established independent legal advice centres. And as honourable members in this House will know, access to that service is so vital. We see it in our casework. And it's important for citizens to have access to that free legal advice. The sector has faced so many cuts over the years, and since the lockdown, the demand has grown. Demand for people facing debt, demand for people facing employment issues. If these centres are to close, it will cause unimaginable stress. Can the Minister outline what steps he's taken to ensure these vital services are available for citizens?
Or Secretary Buffett.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for raising an important and enduring issue, and I too similarly pay tribute for the work that law centres and other organisations play in administering important advice and those first steps that are so crucial sometimes in actually dealing effectively with problems that can be averted. Already, as part of pre-COVID work, we had allocated £5 million for early legal help, and I know my honourable friend, the Parliamentary Under Secretary, is working tirelessly to evolve a scheme of early legal support and advice. It's something that I passionately endorse as well, and we will continue to develop that and to achieve the ends that I think both she and I share.
8 withdrawn, so go to Mira Hobbs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Female Offender Strategy rightly recommends women's centres over custodial sentences. But the funding commitment committed as part of the strategy ran out in March. The Minister earlier actually referred to more funding for women's services. But I'm talking about women's centres, and I've been unsuccessfully trying to set up one in Bath. Will the government commit to providing a significant amount of core funding for women's centres?
Minister.
Well, if I could correct the Honourable Lady, the £2.5 million that we have committed this year for the female offender strategies will be going directly to women's centres where they bid for it. So I'm very happy to talk to her about her particular centre, but the £2.5 million is specifically to help sustain the women's centres to continue to support our female offenders.
Sarah Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What steps is my honourable friend taking to ensure that all victims, but in particular those who's subject of crimes such as sexual-related offences or modern slavery, are being properly supported and their rights are being properly protected during this time?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. I know she works closely with support services and victims groups in her constituency. And we're committed to ensuring that victims like the one she mentioned receive the support they need. We've delivered £22 million of emergency funding to support victims of domestic abuse and sexual violence. That has reached more than 540 charities in the front line so far. And indeed, following the No. 10 Hidden Harms Summit that I took part in, we're delivering an action plan that put victims at the centre of the criminal justice system and indeed our courts recovery programme, and we are strengthening the Victims Code, Mr. Speaker, to establish a clearer set of rights for victims.
Let's head up to Manchester with Andrew Gwynn. Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At a time when England's entering a second national lockdown, potential victims of domestic abuse are again increasingly vulnerable. So what steps are being taken to make sure that trials of people accused of domestic abuse and indeed support for their victims are being prioritised by government?
Secretary Butler.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman, and he can be reassured that throughout the pandemic, domestic abuse cases appearing in the Magistrates' Court and indeed in the Crown Court have been given the priority that we all expect them to be allocated. And we've seen, of course, a big demand spike in the COVID crisis for domestic abuse support services, which is why the package that I referred to in the previous answer, the £25 million package, of which £22 million has already been allocated to support groups relating to domestic abuse and sexual violence, is already making a real difference to victims and those affected by domestic abuse.
Mike Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The record shows that because of police underfunding, Cleveland Police is 500 officers down. Hartlepool Magistrates Court has closed and our local cells have been mothballed. Would the Minister agree to meet with me to discuss the reopening of our police cells in Hartlepool as a matter of importance in order to build back confidence?
Secretary Butler.
Well, I'm sure the honourable gentleman would support very much the government's moves to scale up the number of police officers, and in Cleveland the numbers are already rising in an encouraging way. I note the point that he makes about particular custodial facilities. Of course, I'll discuss the matter with him. He will know that it is vital that we maintain local justice, but at the same time to make sure that we use remote technology as well in order to really get cases on as quickly as possible and to deliver justice to victims.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Lord Chancellor will be aware of my constituent Kelly Ormrod, whose parents sadly died whilst on holiday in Egypt more than 2 years ago. Unfortunately, in the last 2 years, the UK coroner has been unable to get the answers he needs to be able to identify cause of death, and that has caused great anxiety for the family and denied them the answers that they're looking for. Would the Lord Chancellor therefore meet with me and Kelly to see how we can progress this case through the UK coroner to give them the answers they deserve?
Secretary Butler.
My honourable friend has worked tirelessly on this very sensitive and sad case, and I pay tribute to him for his hard work on the part of his constituents, and I'm sure that this delay is causing them additional distress. Of course, I'll be happy to meet him. He knows that sadly the government cannot compel the production of documents for a coroner's investigation from the Egyptian authorities, but my officials have indeed contacted the senior coroner in the local area for more details and an update, and I understand that the senior coroner has now written to the Egyptian Prosecutor General.
Dr. Lusick.
Many thanks, Mr. Speaker. The Why People project in Lindsay House in East Kilbride, my constituency, saw the police called out 700 times in 2 years in respect of antisocial behaviour, crime, weapons and drug use. This has continued to a high rate even during lockdown. Local residents now tell me they are terrified, and parents are saying that children are being offered drugs during their school lunch breaks. So what more can be done to provide intensive offender and substance abuse rehabilitation prior to relocation to local communities so that residents are not put at such pervasive risk?
Well, the Honourable Lady raises a very serious case in her constituency v Lothian. I'm sure that her colleagues in the Scottish Government, who of course have always had responsibility for these matters, it being a separate criminal jurisdiction, will consider this very carefully. I'm concerned to hear that in that local instance, despite the best intentions, there doesn't seem to be that reach into the community to give them the comfort that and the confidence that they deserve. Can I say that south of the border we're working very hard to enhance and improve community treatment requirements to deal with drug addiction, to deal with alcohol abuse, and indeed to try and get to the root causing of some of this reoffending that causes misery to communities like the one that she serves.
Anthony Backman.
Mr. Speaker, my constituency of Totnes in South Devon is home to Landworks, a fantastic charity that helps those at risk of going to prison or prisoners into jobs and back into the community. With so many prisoners released every month who are unable to access universal credit and housing, will the Minister meet with me to be able to discuss how we can improve access to those mechanisms as well as visiting Landworks?
Minister Fraser.
I would be very happy to visit when we're allowed to visit, but certainly before then discuss the issues in his constituency and pay tribute to the work of Landworks that's doing work in his area. The issue of universal credit is fundamental, as is getting people into homes, and I work very closely with my counterpart at DWP and with the Secretary of State for DWP, along with the Lord Chancellor, to ensure that prison leavers can access universal credit in a timely way on their release. We're doing other work in relation to getting a job and a home.
Final question, Lucy Allen.
Very grateful, Mr. Speaker. As we enter another lockdown with severe restrictions on prisoners, will the Minister consider the impact of very serious other harms that the minimising COVID risk causes to prisoners, prison officers and their families?
Well, the Honourable Member makes an extremely important point. We are very conscious, having imposed very restrictive conditions, of the impact of those conditions on those in our custody and care. And since restrictions were lifted over the summer, prison staff across the country have already worked very hard to open up the estate, and since the end of the previous lockdown, we've reintroduced visits in every prison, and 119 of our prisons are operating at stage 3 of the national framework. This reintroduced key work, education, offender management activities where it was appropriate to do so. As we re-enter a new phase, we are thinking very carefully about the balance between security and resistance to the virus against mental health needs of our prisoners.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order. Order. Before I call the Shadow Chancellor to ask her urgent question, I have a brief statement to make. Motion number 9 on today's order paper extends the proxy voting scheme to allow proxies for unruled members present on the precincts of the Palace. If the motion is passed, I intend to introduce the new scheme with effect from tomorrow, including unruled members who make their designation before 9:30 a.m. tomorrow. To apply for a proxy, members must email proxyvote@parliament.uk with the name of their nominated proxy. On subsequent days, notice will be given before the House rises the proceedings sitting days or 3 o'clock on a non-sitting Friday. I now call Shadow Chancellor Annalise Dodds to make her urgent question. Annalise.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. To ask the Chancellor of the Exchequer if he will make a statement on economic support available to individuals and businesses during and after the recently announced lockdown.
Secretary Barclay.
Mr Speaker, yesterday the Prime Minister set out why we are introducing new measures to tackle coronavirus. This decision...
Toby, I don't need this all the way through. Please, I want to get on with this statement. I've granted a UQ. I don't need the backbenches chirping. Secretary Barclay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Yesterday, the Prime Minister set out why we are introducing new measures to tackle coronavirus. This decision is not one we would wish to take, but it responds to the soaring infection rate. And just as we have a responsibility to protect lives, we must also safeguard livelihoods. That's why the government has provided unprecedented levels of financial support throughout this crisis, a package described by the IMF as one of the best examples of coordinated action globally. This includes an extension to the coronavirus job retention scheme, where employees will receive 80% of their usual salary, up to a maximum of £2,500, while employers need only pay national insurance and pension contributions. We'll provide more support to the self-employed. We are increasing the self-employed income support scheme grant from 40% to 80% in November. This boosts the total grant from 40% to 55% for the trading profits from November to January, up to a total of £5,160, aligning it with the furlough scheme. In addition, homeowners hit by the pandemic can continue to claim a 6-month mortgage holiday, and businesses required to close can receive non-repayable grants worth up to £3,000 a month. In total, Mr Speaker, these grants are worth over £1 billion a month. We are also planning to extend the existing business loan schemes and the Future Fund to the end of January, as well as making it possible to top up bounce-back loans. Local authorities will also receive £1.1 billion to support businesses more broadly, and up to £500 million to support the local public health message through the Contain Outbreak Management Fund. We will also uplift the Barnet Guarantee this week to give Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland further certainty over their upfront funding. And Mr Speaker, these measures build on the government's economic package that now totals over £200 billion. They will provide security to millions of people while giving businesses the flexibility to adapt and plan. And they underline our unrelenting focus on listening and responding to the damaging path of this virus.
Thank you very much for granting this urgent question, Mr Speaker. The circuit breaker Labour proposed 3 weeks ago would have been shorter and more effective, so less damaging to jobs and businesses than the government's last-minute but lengthy lockdown. The cost of that Conservative delay will be counted in lives and livelihoods. So can I ask, was it the Chancellor who vetoed the circuit breaker? Why did he tell the Welsh Government it was impossible to extend furlough? And why did he dismiss those in the north who said his plans would lead to hardship? I heard from one restaurant about the strain caused by this panicked, last-minute approach. As rumours of a lockdown circulated on Friday, staff wiped away tears before putting on a brave face to customers. They didn't know whether they would be working as normal the following week, face redundancy, be paid at 67% of their normal wages, or be paid at 73%. Similarly, the self-employed endured intransigence, then rumour, before a last-minute announcement yesterday, which still leaves many people with nothing. Businesses need to know what support they'll receive if their area faces further restrictions the other side of lockdown. But the Prime Minister yesterday said they won't find out until just before those restrictions are imposed. So can the Chief Secretary tell me, how can any business plan on that basis? How can people cope with that level of insecurity? The lack of any plan for economic support is making a very, very difficult situation even worse. Will the Chancellor and his ministers finally get a grip and set out that plan for the next 6 months? Will they indicate how the different scenarios facing us will be dealt with? Not retrospectively, not at the last minute, not once businesses have gone bust and jobs have already been lost, but in advance. Will they set out a plan for support if the lockdown is extended, or if different regions or devolved nations remain under restrictions afterwards? And finally, will I continue having to drag government ministers here week after week as this government stumbles from one crisis to the next? Thank you.
Minister Bartlett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Right Honourable Lady started by saying that the circuit breaker would be shorter. But her own front bench, when interviewed, repeatedly said that a circuit breaker would have to be repeated. And the point is that the Deputy Chief Medical Officer was clear when he said that an earlier national lockdown wouldn't have been appropriate because, as he said, the path of the virus was very low in certain areas, such as the southwest at that time, and therefore the economic damage would have been disproportionate. And I might expect some members of the House still to argue that argument, but it is surprising that the economic spokesperson for the opposition front bench will be willing to see that economic direct at odds, which you may chanter from the front. I am simply, Mr. Speaker, quoting the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, whose advice was it would be the wrong action to take at that time, and I'm pointing to the economic damage, which the Right Honourable Lady seems to see as trivial and something to be disregarded. So she then said, she then asked about whether the government, or claimed that the government had in some way dismissed certain parts of the United Kingdom. Well, if I can just gently point out that the furlough had not ended, Mr. Speaker. The furlough continued to the end of October. It's now been extended. So there has been no gap in the furlough provision. So the furlough has continued to all parts of the United Kingdom without any gap in its provision. She then says, as to whether the government has a plan in place. Well, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, came to the House on the 24th of September and set out our winter plan for jobs. It included things such as the Kickstart scheme, which has already launched, is already up and running, providing much needed training to our constituents across the country. And that is part of the winter plan that my right honourable friend set out. But at the same time, when doing so, he was candid in saying that if the pathway of the virus changed, then this would be a government that would listen and adapt in response to that. And that is exactly the action that we have taken. And then finally, Mr. Speaker, somewhat strangely, the Right Honourable Lady then said that she needs to drag ministers to the chamber in order to set out an approach. Well, that's what she was repeating the point. Mr. Speaker, I thought the Prime Minister was here yesterday in order to give a statement to the House. It's somewhat strange to say that the day after the Prime Minister gave a statement to the House that ministers are being dragged to the chamber in order to give an update on the position that he set out.
Order. I think it's myself that decides whether we have an urgent question, and I'm sure you won't be questioning my judgment on that. Minister Bartlett.
Mr. Speaker, I would hope you know me well enough that I would never do so, and if any impression of that was given, then obviously I would clarify that on the record. My point was the diligence of ministers in updating the House was demonstrated by the Prime Minister yesterday in the statement that he gave.
We'll leave it on this, but it's no good when it's played through the press Saturday, Sunday, where everybody already knows there was no shot by Monday, hence why you can judge a UQ. I will leave it at that, Minister Bartlett.
So, well, we have a plan set out in the winter plan. We have always demonstrated that we will listen and adapt. That is what this government is doing, and is setting out a comprehensive package of support to protect as many jobs and livelihoods as possible.
Right, let us head to Central Devon with the Chair of the Select Committee, Mel Stride.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I broadly welcome the new measures that the government has brought forward to support jobs, in particular the increase in support for the self-employed, the 40% to 80% under the SEISS arrangements. However, as my right honourable friend will know, the Treasury Select Committee produced a report earlier this year in which we identified over 1 million individuals, particularly the self-employed, who are missing out on this kind of support. So could my right honourable friend update the House as to whether any of those identified in that report are now receiving support under these new measures where they were not receiving them before? And if the answer is that there are none, could I ask him why that is the case?
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend is right to point to the fact that there were some that were not covered, and in fact that has been an area of much debate within this House. He will understand there is a distinction between those who are employees who, because their details haven't been notified to HMRC at the cut-off point last time, had been excluded, and those, because of the furlough extension, will now be included moving forward. So there are some of that population cohort that are covered. In respect of the cohort relating to the self-employed, then he will also be aware that we've offered over £13 billion of support so far to the self-employed, which is generous by international standards. But he knows within that there are different cohorts. So there's the cohort relating to company directors, where the issue remains the same, one of what is dividend income and what is not. He will know that another part of that group is those earning above £50,000, where we made a decision to target support below that threshold. He'll know that some of those relate to people who are self-employed, but it not being the majority of their income, so less than 50% is through their self-employed, and we targeted funding on those where their self-employment was their main provision. So there are different cohorts within the excluded population, but those who were employed will be covered by the furlough extension.
SNP spokesperson Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This UK government continues to lurch around in absolute chaos. A Prime Minister forced to come on TV due to the leaks of his plans after hours of delay, squeezing in before strictly to announce an English lockdown and the extension of furlough just before it was due to expire. And Mr. Speaker, we have been telling them that it would need to be extended for months. And while I welcome this action, the late extension will be absolutely no comfort to those who have already lost their jobs due to this government's incompetence, or to the businesses in my constituency who have done their utmost to support their staff and now have no idea where they stand. No comfort either to those who he continues to ignore, those excluded from the initial support schemes facing a bleak winter ahead. Will he ensure they don't lose out again? And still many sectors of the economy that cannot yet go back to normal. Mr. Speaker, the overwhelming sense for many of us here is that this is not a union of equals. When Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland and parts of the north east of England asked for furlough to be extended this autumn, they were told the Chancellor's magic money tree had lost all its leaves. But yet, when the Prime Minister decided that England needed to go into urgent lockdown, it turned out the magic tree money tree was in fact an evergreen. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister gamed his answers on furlough in this House yesterday in a pathetic and transparent attempt to make the Honourable Member for Murray look good. But he was contradicted by the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government on Sky News this morning, who said it would be up to the Chancellor to decide if furlough would be available to the devolved nations after the 2nd of December. Now, Mr. Speaker, in an act of further disrespect, the Chancellor isn't even here today to answer this question. So will he be clear and will he be honest? Will the Treasury make furlough and cease available at 80% to any part of these islands that requires it after the 2nd of December?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady started by saying that we were disrespecting parts of the United Kingdom. I was on a call with the Chancellor Duchy of Lancaster, the First Secretary of State, the Home Secretary and others, with the First Minister of Scotland, the First Minister of Wales, First Minister and Deputy Minister of Northern Ireland yesterday as part of our regular dialogue with them. So that continues across the United Kingdom, and indeed at official level the Chief Medical Officers liaise extremely closely together. Secondly, it's somewhat both surprising and disappointing that the fact that the government has listened and introduced for the first time an upfront Barnett guarantee, which has provided the Scottish Government with £7.2 billion of funding at an earlier point than would traditionally be the case, recognising the volatility of the situation in COVID. Amongst the various grievances that the Honourable Lady, it would be good to recognise that that is unprecedented, that is different. And again, on the call yesterday, I signalled to the First Minister that we would update this week with a further uplift, again following that unprecedented action to give more clarity in terms of the Barnett guarantee and the consequences that flow. Thirdly, again, the Honourable Lady keeps gentering, but the point is many of these schemes are UK-wide schemes, Mr. Speaker. So we've extended the loans, we've extended the CJRS, the self-employed income support scheme. The way that these can be delivered is through the broad shoulders that the United Kingdom offers. It is through that capacity to act as one United Kingdom that we have been able to protect up to 1 million jobs in Scotland. And I think it is important that we work together. That's why we were engaging with the Scottish Government yesterday, and I think more can be achieved if the Scottish Government and the UK Government work together. That is how, to date, we've protected up to 1 million jobs, and I think that is the best way forward.
Mr. Speaker, as we've just seen, uncertainty in Scotland is always a basis for grievance with the SNP. So, my right honourable friend, however, can end that uncertainty by just simply clarifying that should scientific evidence demand a further lockdown in Scotland, the furlough scheme at 80% will be available to protect jobs in Scotland.
Well, my right honourable friend is right to pick up on that sort of grievance culture. And it is through our ability to act on a UK basis that we've been able to offer the unprecedented support that we have to date. Now, furlough has always been a UK-wide scheme, and as the Prime Minister said, the government will always be there to provide support to all parts of the United Kingdom.
Marika Lippon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month, the government disgraced itself by voting against extending free school meals into the holidays for our most vulnerable children. Even if the government will not reverse this cruel decision, will they at least follow Action for Children's recommendations and extend free school meals for all families in receipt of universal credit?
Well, again, I think what is important is the Honourable Lady raises a very serious issue and one that all members of the House care deeply about. But it is also important to look at the package as a whole. We have put in an additional £9 billion of welfare support, recognising the increasing pressures that there are. That includes the £20 uplift on universal credit. It includes the lifting of the minimum income guarantee. It includes the various sort of package of measures. But above all, retaining jobs and getting people back into the labour market is the best way that we protect people from poverty.
Let's head to Bexleyheath with Sir David Eminent. Sir David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend's positive response today on additional measures of economic support. Does he agree that our government has committed one of the most comprehensive and generous economic support packages anywhere in the world, worth over £200 billion, and this is the right approach in these difficult times? My right honourable friend rightly quotes the IMF in saying our response is one of the best examples of coordinated action globally. But isn't it also important that the IMF also praised our response for holding down unemployment?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for that. He's quite right to pick up on the IMF report and the comments of the director of the IMF, and it's perhaps just worth reminding the House exactly what the IMF director said, and it was, and I quote, "The UK's economic support package is one of the best examples of coordinated action that we have seen globally. I very much agree with my right honourable friend, and I think that speaks to the comprehensive package that my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has put in place.
Tony Antoniazzi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Prime Minister did say that funding would be available for the furlough scheme in the devolved nations, not just now, but for the future. And as the Minister has just pointed out, the furlough is a UK-wide scheme needed in all parts of the United Kingdom, not at the behest of the Chancellor. And then this morning, the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government said that it would be a matter for the Chancellor, not the Prime Minister. So can the Minister confirm today what exactly the situation is and tell the businesses in Gower and across the United Kingdom what the situation is? And also, could he tell us who is in charge, the Chancellor or the Prime Minister?
Mr. Speaker, we've already extended the furlough for the rest of this month, and as the PM said yesterday, we will always be there for all parts of the United Kingdom.
Simone Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some of the most difficult conversations I've had this year are with Stroud's wedding and events industries and the supply chains. You know, great businesses like Eastington Park, Stonehouse Court, Elmore Court, Bisley Hire. They're usually thriving, but they are basically feeling ignored. They've had a stop-start situation this year, and we are nervously now looking at next year, having lost a year's revenue. Will you commit to looking at this valuable sector again to see what support we can make available, and will you meet with me to discuss this matter as well?
Well, firstly, Mr. Speaker, I'm always very happy to meet with my honourable friend, and she's right to talk about a sector that has been particularly hit by the impact of the COVID pandemic. As you'll be aware, as part of the comprehensive package of support, then sectors like that qualify for the extension to the job retention scheme, the cash grants of up to £3,000 per month to businesses that are closed, and also I would point her to the 1.1 billion of additional funding that has been allocated to councils, which is a key part of the business support at their discretion that they can allocate to those businesses acutely hit within their authorities.
Let's head up to Scotland with Christine Jardine. Christine Jardine.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Businesses across my constituency and across the country made irreversible decisions last week based on advice from the government. Furlough was going to end on Saturday. They now find themselves in a situation where furlough has been extended, but only for a month. And there's a complete lack of clarity still today about the devolved nation. So can the Chief Secretary please urge the Chancellor to extend furlough through to the spring, because COVID-19 is not going away at the end of this month? And can he give us a simple one-word answer? Is furlough going to be available to the devolved nations, or is he going to continue this uncertainty which is damaging the Union?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, well, at risk of repeating myself, I refer the honourable lady to the reply I gave earlier. But she did ask a specific point in terms of those who may have recently been made redundant. Again, the honourable lady chunters from a sedentary position. She asked a specific point in terms of those recently made redundant. I was just coming on to answer that precise point. And employees notified by the RTI submission to HMRC on or before the 30th of October are eligible for the furlough extension, but employees employed as of the 23rd of September, which is the day of the job support scheme announcement, and notified to HMRC by RTI on or before that date, who have since been made redundant, can be rehired. So in answer to the Honourable's question, the timing is important, but the point is people can be rehired as part of that furlough extension.
Sir John Redford.
I'm glad the government agrees that where by law it stops people working and earning a living, it should compensate them. So will the government look again at the terms of the scheme for the self-employed, where there are restrictions on several categories of self-employed who have no other means of earning their living or no large company support, and be more generous? And does he agree with me? We need all those self-employed people to be ready to return to work, to get some kind of recovery going soon, because the economy is in deep trouble.
Well, I agree with my right honourable friend, which is we need to ensure that the economy is able to bounce back quickly. That's why we provided over £13 billion of support to the self-employed, which by international comparisons, and I know my right honourable friend looks at international comparisons, he will see is extremely generous. I have set out previously in the House, Mr. Speaker, part of the operational difficulties, for example, with owner directors in terms of what is dividend income or not. But the point is we have set out a generous self-employed income support scheme, but we also need to deliver that operationally in a way that meets the tests set by, for example, the Public Accounts Committee, that has also said, do we have the right levels of controls in place given the speed at which these schemes were deployed?
Tommy Wilson.
Speaker, the latest ill-advised lockdown is going to present an enormous burden to the economy in terms of lost tax revenue, additional government spending and reduced GDP. But it is right that since the economic pain is imposed by the government, that those affected should be compensated for the pain which they're going to have to suffer. And I welcome his assurance that the furlough scheme will apply across the whole United Kingdom. But could he tell us what warrant consequences will be received by Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales in terms of the business support grant which he has announced in this package?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the right honourable raises a very valid and fair point, and as I said on my call with the First Minister yesterday, I hope to be in a position to update her this week in terms of the additional Barnett guarantee that we can give. He's quite right to point to the consequentials that flow from the additional local authority funding that the Chancellor set out, the £1.1 billion. He'll also have seen, for example, the additional support that UK government gave to Transport for London, for example, the rail support measures that the UK government has provided, and so on. And so those are the issues on which the Barnett consequentials will be shaped. He's absolutely right that it is important they have sight of that. That's why we've taken the unprecedented decision to give this upfront guarantee, and I hope to be able to update on that later this week.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My heart is breaking for businesses across the Windsor constituency and the country, once thriving businesses. I've met with owners of pubs, clubs, restaurants, bars, sports venues, salons and retail outlets. They cannot magically become online businesses. I've spoken with business owners who've literally been in tears on the phone and in person when they think about their staff and their livelihoods. So the new lockdown proposed will prove fatal to many of these businesses. And there are so many questions about the strategy, about the need for a lockdown, and about the generous support the government is trying to give. But can I contain my question to this? How does the government intend to protect retail businesses that are forced to close from the increasing dominance of online retailers who often benefit from lower business rates and tax than their terrestrial partners?
Well, I know, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend has a deep understanding of business from his career prior to coming to the House, and he's absolutely right to talk of the personal consequences, the commitment that people who set up and run businesses have made, and the devastating impact that the virus and the consequences are having. In terms of the position on tax, he, from his time in the House, will know those are questions for the budget and for my right honourable friend, the Chancellor. But in terms of the support that has been given to businesses, I would direct him to the extension of the loans that we've given to help businesses with their cash flow, recognising that the biggest cost for many businesses is the fixed costs of their property, and so the up to £3,000 a month grant for those with rentable values above 51,000, and the support to local authorities, as I referenced to my honourable friend a moment ago, in terms of their discretionary support to specific businesses with local authorities. So it's part of that comprehensive package, but he's absolutely right to draw attention to the human consequence of these decisions.
Carl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Any additional investment to help the self-employed is welcomed, and I do welcome it. Can I ask him to look at the eligibility criteria that he has set? Because with the furlough scheme, the eligibility criteria has been updated so that businesses right up to last Friday that have been registered with a bank account can apply. But for self-employed, the eligibility hasn't changed at all. It is going to exclude very many people who are self-employed from all the additional investment that is now available. Will he look at it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, such has been the number of times this has been raised in the House and the campaign that it is something we have looked at. Now, some of those issues have not changed. So, for example, the difficulty of determining, referring to my right honourable friend a moment ago, what is, for example, dividend income as opposed to earned income. We did take a decision to target in terms of those below the 50,000 threshold. So some of those issues have not changed from that period before. He's right to draw the fact that the furlough does allow some of those who were excluded to now come within scope. But I would draw, Mr. Speaker, the House's attention to the fact that even within the House there is a degree of conflict here, because the Treasury Support Committee has said that we should be more willing to bring the cohort of self-employed into scope, and yet the Public Accounts Committee has expressed its concern that we need to have much stricter operational controls in terms of the risk, for example, of fraud. So you see that even between the two select committees in this House. So the different cohorts within what's known as the excluded campaign, some of those on furlough will be able to come back into scope, but much of the rationale has not changed. But of course, we continue to look at it.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I seek further clarification as to the previous answer and also the point raised by my right honourable friend from Wokingham, where we have self-employed people who have in effect created a limited company and draw dividends? They are being prevented by the government from trading, and therefore, rather than just outlining the difficulties, could the Minister commit to actually saying we're going to find a way around this, so the guidance, we can actually tell our constituents what support they are going to receive during the next few weeks?
Well, Mr. Speaker, for reasons that I set out some time ago to the Treasury Select Committee, and for reasons my right honourable friend the Chancellor has said, that operationally the concern with that is the risk that whilst there will, of course, be many legitimate circumstances where people wish to make a claim for that, unfortunately there will be significant risk of fraud as well. And I pointed to the fact that within the House itself, part of the challenge is how we ensure we have the right balance between the speed of delivery, and we move quickly to get schemes to people, with the operational controls we put in place. And that's why we've taken the position we have.
Sandra Beckham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the last lockdown was lifted, 2 leisure centres in my constituency have not reopened. Both of the facilities were outsourced by my council due in part to the lack of funding to local authorities. Leisure centres such as these are vital to the mental health and well-being of communities that they serve. Indeed, I believe they should be defined as an essential service. I therefore ask the Minister, what will be done to ensure that this essential service and leisure centres such as St George's Antilla Leisure Centre in my constituency do not face permanent closure as a result of this incoming and any future lockdown?
Well, the Honourable Lady is right to point to the pivotal nature of leisure centres within our constituencies. I think that is something that all members of the House would agree with. I draw her attention to the £4.7 billion of additional funding that we have given to local authorities as part of our response to COVID, and also the discretion that we have given local authorities in order that they can apply that funding with the local knowledge that they have, and therefore target it in the most effective way.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, I'd like to welcome the unprecedented and innovative package of support that the Chancellor has put in place, which has undoubtedly helped to support businesses and families in my constituency. But can I ask my right honourable friend what more he can do to support the coach tourism sector specifically? Small family companies like A&P Travel and Sleafordian Coaches, they've done so much, Mr. Speaker, to make their transport COVID secure. But whilst the venues that they support have received funding from the Cultural Recovery Fund and enhanced local authority grants, they have not. We need to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that when the theatres, museums and the like are able to reopen, there is still a viable coach tourism industry to get their customers there.
Well, coach firms are a particular sector that has been particularly impacted as a consequence of COVID. That is why, in response to that, we worked with the Department for Education to provide over £70 million of funding for local transport which again has been of benefit to many, including coach firms. And of course, the wider package of support applies to this sector as it does others. So, for example, the furlough scheme, the cash grants of up to $3,000 for those businesses that are closed, the extended loans and so forth. That wider package applies. But I'd also draw my honourable friends' attention to the specific education funding that has been provided, which I know has been a help to a number of coach firms.
Tricia Gibson.
Mr Speaker, if there were no confusion about the furlough support for Scotland in the event of another lockdown, his own Tory MPs and members across this House would not need to constantly have to ask for clarification on this. And that confusion and uncertainty is a failure of his own government, after his Community Secretary said it would be for the Chancellor to decide at the time of any future Scottish lockdown. Will the Minister apologise for this confusion and uncertainty, and will he meet with the Scottish Finance Minister, who has been requesting a meeting since Saturday's leak, to discuss funding for Scotland and put an end to this chaos, confusion and uncertainty which is detrimentally affecting jobs and businesses in Scotland?
Well, Mr Speaker, I do find it somewhat surprising to be asked to have a meeting the day after I had a meeting with the First Minister of Scotland, who I assume spoke with the authority of the Scottish Finance Minister. So you know, I have regular meetings with the Scottish Finance Minister. I hope that, and I certainly for my part feel we have a very constructive dialogue. It is in part due to her representations that the Barnett Guarantee, this unprecedented upfront guarantee, was put in place, and I look forward to further discussions with her in the weeks ahead.
Caroline Noakes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Pubs like the Crown in Kingsholborn are really concerned about how they will weather the coming lockdown. They make the not unreasonable point that if it is safe to sell takeaway food, it should also be safe to sell takeaway beer. Will my right honourable friend look at this anomaly and see if he can throw a lifeline to these valuable community hubs?
Well, I think my right honourable friend makes an interesting point. I think she will know that in terms of the epidemiology and the guidance, then that is for my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health. But she is right in terms of these questions to point to the economic impact of these measures, and that is something we continue to have close dialogue with colleagues in the Department of Health to ensure she gets the clarification she seeks.
Mr Speaker, yesterday the Prime Minister stated in this House the furlough scheme is a UK-wide scheme and will continue to be available wherever it is needed. Can the Minister therefore confirm whether the Prime Minister was right and that furlough support will be available to Wales in the future should public health priorities require restrictions to be reintroduced? A simple yes or no will suffice.
Well, Mr Speaker, several times now I have actually quoted what was said, and what the Prime Minister said was that the government will always be there to provide support to all parts of the United Kingdom. And I think, you know, it's worth just taking a step back and looking at the fact that through the UK-wide ability to act, that is how we have been able to provide so much support across the UK, act with schemes such as the furlough scheme, the self-employed scheme, the loans extensions and so forth. It's our ability to act across the United Kingdom that has helped many businesses weather the storm.
Can I begin by thanking the government on behalf of the businesses and employees in my constituency who have benefited and will continue to benefit from the extraordinary steps that have been taken. But we know, sadly, people have already lost their jobs and we may expect future job losses. What more can we do to help people to overcome this incredibly difficult time in their lives in terms of support for job seekers and for retraining? I know there are jobs out there, but it's how we get people into those jobs in growing areas.
Well, my right honourable friend makes a hugely important point. It's not just the number of jobs that are lost, but it's the duration of time that people are out of those jobs that is critical in terms of mitigating the economic scarring that results from this pandemic. That is why my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, set out in his winter plan the plan for jobs. That included £2 billion of funding for the Kickstart scheme. I'm very pleased, I was speaking to the Secretary of State for DWP this morning. I'm very pleased to hear the progress that has already been made on the Kickstart scheme that is up and running and providing support to 16 to 24-year-olds across our constituencies, and it's part of that wider package of support on training, the tripling of traineeships, the £2,000 for apprenticeships, the £2 billion on Kickstart, and of course as we accelerate our infrastructure and bring back the green jobs such as the decarbonisation of public buildings, that also offers new opportunities for training as we deliver that record infrastructure investment.
We're now heading to Brighton with Caroline Lucas. Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The new grant scheme for businesses in the hospitality, leisure and accommodation sector is welcome. But those in my Brighton constituency need to know that all small and medium-sized enterprises in that sector will benefit. In particular, will he scrap the business rates link and the rateable value cap from previous schemes, which caused such hardship because they meant, for example, that business tenants in shared buildings got nothing, or that a pub owner in Brighton lost out because rateable values here are higher than in a place like Bolton, for example? Can he reassure them that they will not lose out again?
Well, I think, Mr. Speaker, firstly, it is perfectly fair and reasonable to target the level of support shaped by the rateable value of the property, and that is what my right and friend, the Chancellor, has done. But she is also right to point to the fact that within different local authorities there are different pressures. And that is why in the £1.1 billion that has been allocated, we have given discretion to local authorities in terms of their ability to then target support to businesses in the way that best meets the local need.
Craig Whittaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank my right honourable friend and the whole team at Treasury for a remarkable job they're doing at these very difficult times. I do want to highlight, though, the plight of those people and businesses who have fallen through the financial gap, if I may. Businesses that, through no fault of their own, have had to cease trading or are trading at massive reduction in productivity without grants or access to salary. Not because the government's closed their business, but because they're in the supply chain that supplies the businesses that the government have closed. I wonder if my right honourable friend could at least give some reassurances that consideration is being given to these businesses that have suffered huge losses in the last 9 months. People like Little Valley Brewery in the Calder Valley and the Robin Wood Education Outdoor Centre.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to pick out the specific challenges of the supply chain, often because they supply multiple sectors. And therefore, some of the issues that apply in one sector, they're not within that sector, but they supply across a number of sectors. So he's absolutely right in terms of the issue. Part of the reason we've taken the universal approach in terms of the wider package of schemes, whether on support for cash flow, the loans, the grants, whether on the direct measures to support the labour market in terms of the furlough and the self-employed income support schemes, is to recognise that once one tries to draw demarcation between sectors, one of the sectors where that becomes very difficult is in the supply chain. So part of the package of support that applies to the supply sector is through those universal schemes, but he's absolutely right in terms of the issues that they face.
Let's head to Gateshead with Ian Mearns. Ian Mearns.
Very grateful, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, prior to this lockdown announcement, and despite almost universal calls for an extension to the full furlough scheme in areas with tighter restrictions, which ministers had rejected for months, the government saw fit to announce a new version of this on Saturday, only hours before the previous furlough was due to be replaced by an inferior scheme for us in the north, and with further restrictions becoming inevitable in many areas. So many in the north now believe that until workers in the south were to be affected by the national lockdown, they were somehow to be worth less. Mr. Speaker, businesses in Gateshead and elsewhere are desperate for clarity and certainty to help them in their planning to know and how and if they can survive. Could the Chief Secretary commit today to publishing details of a comprehensive, ongoing financial support package available to business and their workers in areas that will continue to need it, where tiers of restrictions might sadly have to continue after the 2nd of December?
Well, firstly, to the suggestion that there has been a differentiated approach. The point is a number of arrangements were put in place with, for example, as the Mayor of the Liverpool City region, civic leaders in your own Lancashire region, Mr. Speaker, with South Yorkshire, because we recognised that there were additional pressures in those communities. In addition, we also put in further support retrospectively in terms of recognising that a number of areas had been in Tier 2 restrictions for a period of time. So I think the suggestion that additional support had not been offered does not stand that scrutiny. I think what changed, Mr. Speaker, is whereas if one takes the Deputy Chief Medical Officer's advice, whereas it wasn't appropriate previously to have a national lockdown as Professor Van Tam set out, the pathway of the virus was such and the infection increase was such, that is why a more comprehensive approach. So it is a response to the health pandemic as a response to anything that is geographically determined.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the extra support for the self-employed and the news that many of those who didn't qualify for the initial furlough scheme will qualify under the extended scheme. But I want to ask the Minister about the bounce-back loans, which have been a lifeline for so many businesses in my constituency. But back when they made the applications for those loans, businesses wouldn't have foreseen that disruption would have gone on for so long. So can steps be taken to ensure that they're able to apply for top-ups to their initial loan so that they can get through the difficult winter ahead?
In short, Mr. Speaker, yes, they can. He raises a very valid point, which is that a number of businesses will have taken up loans for what they felt was their need at that time. And with the further restrictions that have been placed on businesses, that is exactly why we have then extended the period of availability for loans up to the end of the year. So he is absolutely right in terms of that issue, and I can provide him with that reassurance.
Mr. Brett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has just explained that the response when he spoke to Northern mayors was about health data and not about regions. But he must accept that by callously saying to workers in West Yorkshire and the North that they are on 2/3 of pay, that the government has created a North-South divide that is unnecessary, certainly when we should be coming together as a country to deal with this pandemic. So can the Minister please speak to the Chancellor and ask him for clarity around the restrictions, and when we come out of this national lockdown, that no worker will be expected to be earning 2/3 of their pay, so that those workers in low-paid jobs are not living in fear when they're looking at Christmas and no money in the bank.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady is conflating several different issues. Firstly, the furlough had not expired. It was running to the end of October, so it has applied universally until that point. So the suggestion that the furlough has applied differently is simply not the case. Secondly, in terms of the job support scheme, that is because the purpose of that is different. The design of that is different to the design of the furlough. The furlough is a response to the need for people to stay at home. The job support scheme is to try and encourage them back. That's why the design is for at least 20% one day in the office and the sport. And then the third point is, as my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has set out on a number of occasions, is the 2/3 support is dynamic in terms of its interaction with the wider support through the £9 billion of additional welfare spending. So one needs to look at, firstly, the fact that these are two different purposes behind these two schemes, but the fundamental point is there is no gap between the furlough that was due to expire on the 30th of October and the new furlough extension.
Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend and the team for the package of support, which I know will save jobs and livelihoods across Wimbledon. But he will know that since March I've been raising the plight of people who are excluded from the scheme because they've been forced to close. So I support a number of the comments about self-employed, but could I raise yet again with him one or two excluded industries, like, for instance, the events, the exhibitions business and the hospitality supply businesses, all of whom were excluded from the business rate scheme, the business grant scheme, and need that support if we're going to have those vibrant contributors to the economy in the future.
Well, I'm very aware of the concerns that my right honourable friend has set out, and I point him just to the fact that to date, the Treasury has spent over £200 billion as part of our comprehensive package of support. We have applied a universal approach in terms of the furlough and the loans, the business grants and so forth from a sort of consistency point of view. But I remain happy to have further discussions with him in the weeks ahead.
Let's head up to Scotland with Martin Docherty-Hughes. Martin Docherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While welcoming the news that the support will return to 80%, many regret here in West Dunbartonshire and across Scotland that it's been made last minute, when many would have already have made life-changing decisions in anticipation the rate would be reduced. So to give those we will rely on to rebuild our economy some degree of certainty, will the Minister commit the government to fill the gaps in the scheme so that freelancers and creatives, the excluded, can start to grow the companies of tomorrow?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I firstly draw the Honourable Gentleman's attention to the Future Fund, which has particularly provided additional support. In terms of the point around the timing of the furlough extension, I refer to the answer I gave some time ago in terms of those who have lost their jobs recently could come back through the furlough extension and so would come back into scope as a result of that. So those employees employed as of the 23rd of September, the day of the Job Support Scheme announcement, and notified to HMRC by RTI on or before that date, who have since been made redundant, can indeed be rehired.
Colin Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I draw the House's attention to my registered members' interests? Can I welcome the extension to the coronavirus loan schemes and the ability to top up bounce-back loans? Could my right honourable friend confirm that ability to top up loans also applies to the CBILS scheme as well? Also, would he look at the bounce-back loans for customers of non-bank lenders? According to the research by the All-Party Group for Fair Business Banking, which I chair, there are around 250,000 businesses currently banked with non-bank lenders who do not have access to these schemes because they don't get access to the Bank of England Term Funding Scheme. Will he look at that current problem?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can probably go one better than looking at it myself, from the fact that my honourable friend, the Economic Secretary, who leads on these matters within the Treasury, will have heard his representations and will do so. I know he is looking at the issue in terms of CBILS specifically, and I think there's 28 creditors in terms of his second point, but I know my honourable friend will follow up with him.
Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chief Secretary will be aware that many businesses feel as though the government has acted arbitrarily, imposing restrictions on their sectors, and none more so than the hospitality and the pub sector, with the 10 p.m. curfew. But local independent brewers such as Slaughterhouse and Church Farm in my constituency, and also independent pubs that they serve, such as Somerville and the old post office, in the first lockdown they were able to sell takeaway alcohol, but that's being banned by the government. That will damage that sector dramatically. What has the Chancellor got against pubs?
Firstly, not least through the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, I think one can see the Chancellor's support to this sector. It is also why, for example, the VAT cut was cut from 20% to 5%. It is why many within this sector have benefited, in particular from the wider universal package of schemes such as the furlough. Now, in terms of the exact health advice, as I referred to my right honourable friend, that is a matter for the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, and I will relay the concerns of the honourable gentleman. But that is driven by the epidemiology and the health data. It is not a question of the Treasury acting, as he says, arbitrarily.
Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's financial support included a very welcome £200 million for hospices. However, Norfolk Hospice in my constituency has warned that the national restrictions and closure of charity shops will result in a loss of income for them of £100,000. So can my right honourable friend ensure that when the Care Minister meets the sector tomorrow, a package of urgent support can be put in place for them, for their patients and their families?
Well, my honourable friend raises an issue, I think, that unites the House in terms of the huge value of the work that is done by the hospice movement. That was recognised when the initial as part of the package of measures put in place by my right honourable friend, the £750 million of support to the charity sector, the hospice movement specifically, as he recognises, was identified. I'm very happy to continue working with him as we work together, but we recognise the importance of that sector.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many small business owners have been forced to raid their personal savings in order to keep their businesses afloat over the course of the last 8 months. But that's not a bottomless pit. Many small business owners aren't wealthy people. And the Chief Secretary to Treasury must understand that if they go under, the whole company goes with them. The Treasury has now had 8 months to get this scheme working. Why is it still excluding 3 million people? And does he not recognise that how perilous this situation is for many of those businesses?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I drew attention earlier to the fact that, in fact, over £13 billion has been allocated to the self-employed income support sector and through the income support grant. So that over £30 million indicates the support that the Treasury has given. Now, he draws out, as the chair of the TSC did, in terms of the specific issues around, for example, the company directors. I've set out to the House the difficulty of that in terms of clarifying precisely what is earned income as opposed to dividend income. But I think it is worth drawing the House's attention to the over £13 billion of support that has been allocated.
Heading up to Manchester with Andrew Gwynn. Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. Before lockdown 2, more than 2,000 jobs based at Manchester Airport were reported to be at risk. Now, the government has provided business rate relief to thousands of retail businesses, including £700 million for the likes of Tesco, who've seen huge increases in profit throughout lockdown. So will the government now step in to relieve 2020-2021 airport business rates following the introduction of a new travel ban by funding the difference to local councils?
Well, as I referred to earlier, Mr. Speaker, firstly, in the £1.1 billion of support to local authorities, we have given them discretion to respond to local needs, and that includes to Greater Manchester as a region. As part of in terms of the airport sector specifically, one of the reasons that we have allocated over £12 billion to test and trace is because one of the key issues that I am told by that sector is the importance of travellers being able to be tested quickly and released sooner than has been the case in recent weeks. We're working extremely hard on that issue because that is one of the key measures alongside the financial support to local authorities that would make a real difference to the airport sector.
John Lamont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the commitment we heard yesterday from the Prime Minister that the furlough scheme will extend to Scotland whenever it is needed. But can the Chief Secretary confirm that the self-employment support scheme will also extend to my constituents in Scotland, ensuring that self-employed people are not left behind?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, the same applies. These are UK-wide schemes. We continue to listen and engage, but they apply on a UK-wide basis. That has been the case throughout, and that continues to be the case.
Others.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure we've all heard heartbreaking stories of people who weren't able to claim for self-employment support because they hadn't registered or submitted a tax return for 2018-19. It seems those people are still excluded from any support. Some of these people have been trading for 18 months now. They're clearly not fraudulent. They clearly deserve some support. Why can't they get some?
Well, the point, as we referred to earlier, is part of the package of support, includes areas of support, the £9 billion of welfare, the support through local authorities that is targeted at their discretion. I've set out also within that excluded population, for example, those that were employed may be able to then qualify for the extension, but for the reasons we have covered in a number of earlier replies, part of the challenge from the Public Accounts Committee has been ensuring we have the right operational controls in place, and that has been one of the difficulties in terms of the cohorts which he refers.
Now we go to Alicia Cairns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government's bounce back and business interruption loan schemes have made a huge difference across the country, including providing £90 million of support for businesses in Rutland and Melton. But what assessment has the Chief Secretary made regarding the macroeconomic impact of these loan schemes?
Well, I very much welcome the impact that the various support measures have made in terms of Rutland and to the businesses in her area. In terms of the impact of the various measures, then the OBR produces an independent assessment of that. It will do so on the 25th of November, and that will provide a updated position addressing the impact to which she refers.
Zara Sultana.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. While this week the government has extended the mortgage holiday for homeowners, they have refused to help tenants pay their rent or stop them facing evictions, even if they've lost their job or been placed onto furlough. So how exactly does the Minister think this is fair? And will he instead commit to helping renters in Coventry South by immediately putting a stop to all evictions proceedings, reintroducing the evictions ban and cancelling rent arrears for all tenants?
Minister.
Well, there is, of course, a balance in terms of the interests of those that are renting, but also those who rent out properties, who also have financial pressures that need to be balanced. She referred to the support that has been given, but the best support that can be given to those facing such bills is to help as many people as possible retain their jobs, and that is fundamentally what the package of support we put in place seeks to achieve.
Jack Burton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Further to points about supply chains, many manufacturers in ceramics industry in Stoke-on-Trent very much depend on industries like hospitality and retail. So would my right honourable friend agree to look at what more support can be given to those industries where order books have severely diminished?
Well, I recognise again the point, and my honourable friend and I have spoken about this in terms of the impact on the sectors to which he refers. That is why, Madam Deputy Speaker, such a comprehensive package of support has been set out, including through the Job Retention Scheme, which will now run until the 2nd of December, the generous support to the self-employed, the cash grants of up to £3,000 per month for businesses, the £1.1 billion of council support, and indeed the plans to extend the various loans and the future fund indeed to the end of January, all recognising the wider business pressure to which he refers.
And now we go to Liam Byrne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Unemployment here in the West Midlands is soaring to the level that we last saw in the 1980s, but our mayor has proved so effective that we've failed to secure 95% of what we've asked for in our recovery plan. Now, yesterday, the IMF's chief economist called on governments to bring forward large-scale investment to kickstart demand, and the government has set out its capital budget in May of £358 billion over the next 5 years. Now, the question is, when is the government going to allocate that capital budget? Will the Chief Secretary maximise what's brought forward into the eye of the storm to kickstart demand next year? And will he, for the first time, guarantee that the West Midlands, at long last, will secure its fair share of that money?
Well, I'm slightly surprised from a former Chief Secretary himself to have a question that doesn't recognise the infrastructure investment that the Prime Minister set out in the summer, that my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, also updated the House on through his summer economic update. For example, the £2 billion into the green jobs on public sector decarbonisation. The massive investment in High Speed 2, in RIS 2, in CP6, in terms of the road schemes and the rail schemes that the government has committed to. And we are accelerating through Project Speed the delivery of that infrastructure. Now, he's right to also talk to the fact that there is a jobs challenge. I think it is one, actually, that is shared across the House in terms of concerns with the pressure on employment. That is why it is so important to get the right training package in place. That was addressed by my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, on the 24th of September with his winter plan, setting out schemes such as the Kickstart scheme. That is up and running and is already delivering results. And that is how, together, we will weather the storm in terms of bringing forward infrastructure investment, but also reskilling people where they do lose their jobs.
Mike Wood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Clearly, hospitality and retail have had a particularly difficult time since the spring. But as honourable friends have said, there are many businesses which may not quite come under hospitality or retail or leisure, but which rely almost entirely on those sectors for their business. Will my right honourable friend look at how industries such as brewing, pub supply chains, events and weddings can access the support that the government has provided, such as through the grants and business rate holidays, so that they can protect their jobs and still be going and thriving once this pandemic's beaten?
Sure. Firstly, I refer to the reply Madam Deputy Speaker I gave earlier in terms of the universal nature of the package. There are areas, another one which you didn't mention is the fishing sector, where again they were particularly impacted both through the supply of the restaurant trade, but also their exports, which were also hit. And again, we have listened to concerns there, and we put some additional support. But the best way we will support businesses, whether in the wedding sector, others, is by getting the virus down. That is why we've taken the comprehensive measures that we have over the next 4 weeks, because that is the best way then to be able to open up those sectors and get those people that have been furloughed or have been supported through the self-employed onto the job support scheme, where they will then qualify for the furlough bonus, which will be further support that is available.
And now we go to Glenrothes to Peter Grant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. For all the Minister's sweet talking, the simple fact is that nearly 8 months after the first lockdown was imposed, millions of self-employed people and owners of small businesses are still being excluded from government support. The Minister has spoken approvingly of comments from a recent Public Accounts Committee report today, so could I draw his attention to the committee's 20th report of this session, unanimously agreed by a committee with a Conservative majority. The committee is disappointed that so long after the beginning of the pandemic, HMRC has still not made sufficient use of its data to identify small businesses that have been left out of previous support packages and therefore maximise taxpayer eligibility for grant support. Can the Minister not accept that the committee's disappointment reflects a widely held view across all parties in this House, and that it's time for the excluded £3 million to be supported by actions, not just words?
Well, I have to say I'm somewhat surprised, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Honourable Gentleman talks of actions when, as a result of our ability to operate UK-wide, we've been able to support nearly a million jobs in Scotland. 65,000 businesses in Scotland have benefited from the UK government loan schemes. As of August the 31st, there were 242,600 employments furloughed at a take-up rate of 10%. There has been significant support offered to businesses in Scotland, as indeed across the UK, and it will be and it's odd that the Honourable Gentleman talks about actions and ignores nearly a million jobs that have been supported as a result of the actions the UK government has taken.
Now we go to Devon to Selene Saxby.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Tourism and hospitality businesses have worked hard to get back on their feet. So whilst I welcome the additional support my right honourable friend has announced, can I also ask that he will do all he can to help them in welcoming back visitors in the spring?
Well, Madam Deputy, I absolutely support the Honourable Lady in our desire to see those businesses able to bounce back, and obviously that requires us to get the virus rate down. So we recognise that restrictions have affected in particular tourism and hospitality businesses, but that is why we have put in place additional support, and we'll continue to look at ways to support these industries. But the key to doing so is to reduce the rate of the infection through the measures that the Prime Minister announced yesterday.
I thank the Minister for all that he's done, and it's good to have the help. Yesterday the Prime Minister assured me that there was aid coming to Northern Ireland businesses who had their trade affected by the lockdown in the mainland here. Can the Minister perhaps outline the form that this aid will take place for our suppliers who will have to cease operations, ever mindful of the difference that there is regionally in the Northern Ireland circuit break and here in the mainland tier 1, 2 and 3. On Thursday night it becomes a total lockdown here, and we will be coming out of the circuit break come next week. So what help can businesses in Northern Ireland who are travelling across the water with their supplies?
Well, my honourable friend is right to talk of the impact on businesses in Northern Ireland, and part of that being through the interconnectivity with the rest of the United Kingdom. That is why through the enhanced bonnet guarantee that, as I referred in my earlier answer, we will update the Northern Ireland Executive this week, but through that unprecedented action to give an upfront guarantee that will enable the Northern Ireland Executive to provide support to businesses, and of course it will be for them to determine the exact scope that business support is applied by.
Now we go to Peter Bone.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And first, could I congratulate the Chief Secretary to the Treasury and the government team for the support they've given the British people during this pandemic. I understand that Number 10 has confirmed that there has been a full economic impact assessment done by the Treasury. I wonder if the Chief Secretary could confirm that and when it will be published. It would be very helpful if it was published before tomorrow's vote.
Well, of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, as you would expect, all decisions are informed by economic analysis. But in terms of an impact assessment, the OBR will update their forecasts on the 25th of November. And it's right that we have an independent forecast, and that will be produced in a matter of weeks.
John Ascot.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday, the Prime Minister said that he'll be doing much more to support the voluntary sector, bearing in mind that 10% of charities are likely to fold, with a deficit of £10 billion accumulated over 6 months. What more will the Treasury be putting on the table, and when will that be apparent?
Well, as my right honourable friend has already set out, we put in place a package of support for the charity sector of £750 million as part of the over £200 billion of support that we have given. But as he has also said, and I think clearly demonstrated over recent months, he will continue to listen and adapt as circumstances require.
Now we go to Ruth Cadbury. Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In response to earlier questions, the Minister said the government was reluctant to extend additional financial support to the self-employed because of the need for strict financial controls. So why is the Chancellor's team not as concerned about financial discipline when committing £12 billion of public sector money to the private sector for COVID programmes, and doing so without basic procurement disciplines around proven competency, value for money, and minimum performance targets?
Well, it is simply not correct, Madam Deputy Speaker, because the Department for Health, to whom we have allocated funding for track and trace, is subject to managing public money rules in the same way as any other department. They are subject to the decisions of their accounting officer and their ministers in the usual way. So the normal managing public money rules would apply.
I'm terribly sorry. I missed out the honourable gentleman for St Ives. Derek Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I hope it's worth waiting for. So can I thank the Chief Secretary for all that is being done to help my constituents, West Cornwall and on Scilly. One of the great successes of recent years is the job growth across Cornwall, and that is because of small businesses have been set up by entrepreneurs, by individuals who know they can't get a big job in big business because they don't exist in Cornwall. And so they've set up their business. And the problem is they're very early in their business, they're growing, they're maturing, they're flourishing, but this year has been a disaster for them. Now, they're in a point now where they just don't know if it's worth continuing because of this second lockdown being announced. They just don't know what the future holds. Will the Chief Secretary look very carefully at how we can encourage these people to stick with it, but also look at, as we've discussed already this afternoon many times, the support that is available to them, to these fledgling businesses, so that they really have the finances to sustain these jobs, to make sure these businesses can be part of the recovery that we so badly will need next year and beyond.
Well, as my honourable friend knows, and it was largely down to his representations that specific support was put in place, for example, to maintain the ferry link, that I know was critical within his constituents, and he deserves great credit for the convincing case that he presented to the Treasury, which secured that additional funding. In terms of the wider point, in terms of support to the business community, it is in recognition of the importance of those small businesses that the government has allocated over £13 billion of support to the self-employed income support scheme. But it is also why my right honourable friend the Chancellor has put in place additional measures such as extending the loans that are available to help those businesses get through this period to hopefully the more beneficial period as we come out of the winter period.
Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Thank the Chief Secretary for his statement. I thank all the Treasury team for all the work they've done throughout this pandemic, the agility they've shown in rapidly changing circumstances. And could I also put on record the thanks to those people who've had to implement that. The IT systems in HMRC have stood up incredibly well to a lot of brand new schemes. Now, my constituency in Newcastle-under-Lyme will welcome the extension and enhancement of furlough and the self-employed scheme. For their benefit and for the benefit of the whole House, could he set out how the generosity of those schemes compares internationally, how we're doing in this country compared to the rest of the world?
Well, firstly, can I thank my honourable friend for recognising the huge contribution of officials in HMRC, Treasury and indeed across Whitehall in ensuring that that business support was delivered at the pace that it has been. In terms of the international comparison, I would draw my honourable friend's attention to the report of the Director of the IMF just last week, which I think probably is the best illustration of the way that the UK package of support is seen as offering one of the most comprehensive packages of support. And it was recognised by the IMF, and I think that shows where it stands in terms of international comparison.
Matthew Pennycook.
Madam Deputy Speaker, when concerns were raised earlier about the implications that flow from the fact that rateable values in some parts of the country are far higher than in others, the Chief Secretary could only point to discretionary grant funding. However, not only is the detailed guidance that would allow local authorities to distribute that discretionary funding not yet been published, but it will also be distributed on the basis of a flat rate of £20 per head, irrespective of geographical area, as he knows. So can the Chief Secretary firstly ensure that that guidance is published promptly so local authorities can plan, but also look again at better tailoring support to account for variations in rateable value across the country?
So on the point in terms of guidance being published, I will take that point away and seek to respond constructively to the fair point that he raises. In terms of the £20 a head, part of the representations quite often when I've come to the Chamber is for the government to move at pace to deliver schemes quickly and to do so fairly and without repraising the previous urgent question where the Mayor of Greater Manchester, according to the Labour front bench, was acting for Great Britain in a way that the Mayor of the Liverpool City region and others wasn't, which I felt was an unfair characteristic of their position. The point is we need to deploy schemes quickly, and that is why we've taken the approach that we have.
And finally, David Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'm sorry at the end of this session to have to raise the issue of furlough yet again, but as my right honourable friend will know, the economies of North Wales and the northwest of England are very closely integrated. And Welsh tourism and leisure businesses in particular are heavily dependent upon trade from across the border. Now, the Welsh lockdown imposed by the Welsh Government is due to come to an end on the 9th of November. That will be some 4 days after the lockdown in England is anticipated to begin. Welsh leisure businesses and tourism businesses will not be precluded from reopening by the Welsh Government, but in reality it will be purposeless for them to do so because the trade from England will not be there. So can my right honourable friend say whether Welsh businesses that are affected in this way, that is by lockdown measures imposed in England, will be able to access the coronavirus job retention scheme?
Well, I know, Madam Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend is a strong supporter of the Union, and part of the strength of the furlough scheme has been its ability to support across the United Kingdom. It is a UK-wide scheme, and it is through the Treasury's ability to operate on a UK-wide scheme that we've been able to put in place the over £200 billion of support, which is the comprehensive package which to refer to the question a moment ago, which is why it stands international comparison in terms of its scale and also its speed. That was recognised by the IMF director just last week, and the furlough will continue to be a UK-wide scheme.
Thank you. In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those anticipating the next item of business, we will adjourn for. We will suspend. No, we won't adjourn. No. We will suspend the House for 3 minutes. Order.